Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. We are living in a time of profound uncertainty, but also of clarity if we are willing to look at the facts. My purpose here is not to shock, not to stir emotion for its own sake, but to illuminate the reality that stands before us. And let me begin with a truth that Mr. Trump himself will find impossible to ignore. The United States is no longer the unchallenged center of the global system. The world has changed dramatically and irreversibly. And when Mr. Trump finally realizes this, when he sees the depth of America's decline brought about by reckless choices, short-term politics, and his own hubris, he will melt down because the narrative he built his political career on will collapse before his eyes. For decades, the United States has operated under the assumption that its dominance was permanent, that it could dictate the terms of global engagement without meaningful resistance, and that its military, financial, and political weight could bend any nation to its will. This belief was not only embedded in Washington's foreign policy, but also in the rhetoric of leaders such as Donald Trump, who built his political persona on reviving what he called American greatness. Yet the collapse of this myth is perhaps the most consequential development of our time. The world has changed subtly at first, then rapidly, and the pillars of U.S. dominance are crumbling before our very eyes. The shock of this realization is not only unsettling to America's political establishment, but will prove especially devastating for Trump, whose brand depends entirely on projecting strength. When he finally faces the reality that the old world order is slipping away, the meltdown will not simply be personal, it will be symbolic of an era ending. Consider the extraordinary shifts in the global balance of power. America emerged from World War II as the unrivaled economic and military superpower, accounting for nearly half of global GDP and holding unmatched influence through institutions like the IMF and World Bank. But today, those figures tell a very different story. The United States accounts for less than a quarter of global GDP, and new institutions, alliances, and markets have weakened the centrality of Washington. Nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America no longer look to the U.S. As the unquestioned leader. Instead, they seek partnerships with emerging powers such as China, India, and regional blocs that provide alternative avenues of development. The world is no longer unipolar, it is multipolar, and that shift is irreversible. Here's the hook that Trump cannot ignore: economic gravity has shifted eastward. China, for example, has not only become the world's manufacturing hub, but also the largest trading partner for more than 120 countries. The Belt and Road Initiative has tied together economies across Eurasia and Africa, while technological innovations from AI to green energy are increasingly led outside of the West. For Trump, who believes tariffs and bluster can contain China, this is not just a challenge, it is a complete dismantling of the foundation of his political theater. The American people, too, are beginning to see through the fast aid, the myth that trade wars and tough talk can reverse decades of structural economic change has been shattered by rising consumer prices and supply chain vulnerabilities. What once sounded like power now looks like desperation. But this collapse of the myth is not limited to economics. It extends deeply into the realm of politics and diplomacy. The era when Washington could unilaterally sanction a country and expect immediate compliance is fading. Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and others have shown that they can circumvent U.S. restrictions by building parallel systems of finance, trade, and cooperation with non-Western partners. What once was a display of U.S. control has now become a sign of overreach. Trump's repeated claims that America can strong arm adversaries into submission ring hollow when the evidence shows otherwise. Each failed attempt at dominance highlights the limits of U.S. leverage, revealing the cracks in a system once thought unshakable. The American people are not blind to this. They see that endless wars in the Middle East brought neither security nor prosperity. They recognize that massive military budgets have not prevented declining living standards at home. They watch as highways crumble, schools struggle, and healthcare costs skyrocket, even as Washington pours trillions into overseas interventions. The myth of dominance was always sold as a guarantee of domestic well-being, but that promise has evaporated. When Trump insists that his approach will make America win again, the question many are starting to ask is win what and at what cost? Trump's greatest vulnerability lies in the collapse of this illusion. His political strength has always rested on the perception that he is a fighter who can restore America's lost supremacy. Yet, what happens when the fight is exposed as unwinnable? What happens when voters realize that the problem is not a lack of toughness, but a fundamental shift in the global system? That is the moment of reckoning, the moment when the narrative he has built begins to implode. And when it does, Trump will not have the tools to manage the fallout because his strategy depends entirely on doubling down on a myth that no longer holds. Let me leave you with this thought: when a nation's myth of dominance collapses, it is not simply a foreign policy adjustment, it is a societal shockwave for the United States and for Trump personally. The reckoning with this new reality will be turbulent, emotional, and destabilizing. And yet, acknowledging this collapse is the only way forward. America cannot cling to illusions forever. The question is whether its leaders, Trump included, have the courage to confront the truth before the meltdown consumes them. The rise of the BRICS-AS alliance has fundamentally altered the architecture of global power, and its impact is being felt in ways that leaders like Donald Trump are neither prepared for nor willing to admit. For years, American politicians, particularly those who thrive on nationalist rhetoric, have dismissed these countries as secondary players, fragmented and incapable of serious coordination. Yet the evidence today is undeniable. Bryce is not only alive, but expanding, not only symbolic, but structural, and its trajectory points to enduring rebalancing of economic and political influence in the world. The shock of this reality is immense because it forces the United States to confront a truth it has long resisted. Global leadership can no longer be monopolized, and Trump's vision of America commanding unquestioned loyalty from the rest of the world is rapidly evaporating. The hook here is simple but unavoidable. Bryce now commands more combined economic power in purchasing power parity than the G7, the club of rich Western nations that once set the terms of global trade and finance. That single fact shatters decades of assumptions about how the world economy is supposed to function. China's central role in this transformation cannot be overstated. It has become the manufacturing engine of the world, but more importantly, it is spearheading technological revolutions in artificial intelligence, green energy, and advanced infrastructure development. India, with its vast and youthful population, is projected to become the third largest economy in the coming decade, driven by digital innovation and a rapidly expanding consumer base. Brazil, as the anchor of South America, has leveraged its natural resources and agricultural exports to consolidate influence across multiple markets. Russia, despite facing heavy sanctions, has reoriented its economy toward Asia and strengthened its energy partnerships. South Africa, while smaller in economic size, represents a crucial bridge between emerging Africa and the rest of the world. Taken together, these nations are not an accident of geography or politics. They are a deliberate counterweight to the Western-led system, and their collective strength now forces every country, including the United States, to rethink where alliances and opportunities lie. What makes this shift so destabilizing for Trump's narrative is that it is not simply about numbers, it is about legitimacy. For decades, the G7 dictated the rules of international finance through institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, institutions heavily shaped by U.S. influence. Barises has moved aggressively to build alternatives. The new development bank, created to finance infrastructure projects without the strings attached by Western lenders, is a direct challenge to that order. Nations once trapped in cycles of dependency on Washington or Brussels now see a genuine alternative. For Trump, whose America first posture depends on the ability to wield U.S. leverage as a tool of coercion, this is a nightmare scenario. It undermines the very foundation of his approach because the moment countries have options, America loses its monopoly of power. Another striking feature of Barises is its expansionary momentum. Countries from Saudi Arabia to Argentina have expressed interest in joining, attracted by the potential of a bloc that can rival Western influence without imposing Western conditions. Energy powers in the Middle East, major agricultural exporters, and key players in Africa are increasingly looking at Barises as the future of economic cooperation. Imagine the impact if oil-rich nations integrate more closely into this framework, aligning their trade and energy policies with the East rather than the West. For the U.S., which has long relied on petrodollar dominance and security partnerships in the Gulf, this represents a tectonic shift. For Trump, who repeatedly promised to strengthen America's hand in global energy markets, it is the exact opposite of victory. It is erosion. The hook that every American must understand is this: Barises is not about replacing the West. It is about creating a balance where the West no longer dictates terms. That is why it resonates so powerfully across the global South. Nations tired of conditional aid, exploitative trade, and the arrogance of Western diplomacy are eager to join a system that promises respect, equality, and opportunity. This appeal is something Washington cannot easily counter because it is built on decades of frustration with a one-sided order. Trump's fiery speeches about bringing industries back, punishing China, or forcing allies into submission may rally a domestic base. But on the international stage, they only accelerate the search for alternatives. The louder he insists on American dominance, the faster the world builds structures to bypass it. And this is where the danger lies. Trump, like many nationalists, thrives on denial. He will claim Barises is irrelevant, that America's military superiority still guarantees dominance, that sanctions can crush any opposition. But denial does not stop reality. The rise of Barises is not a headline, it is a historical trend reshaping the flow of trade, investment, and diplomacy. The U.S. can either adapt or resist, but it cannot erase the change. For Trump, who has anchored his politics in the illusion of restoring an era of unquestioned supremacy, acknowledging Bress is admitting that the world has moved on. That is a truth he is ill equipped to handle, and when it sinks in, the meltdown will be personal, political, symbolic of the broader unraveling of an outdated worldview. The economic reality inside the United States is no longer something that can be hidden behind political slogans or fiery campaign rallies. Inflation is eroding the purchasing power of working families. Wages are stagnating in real terms despite headline growth numbers. Inequality continues to widen, and America's infrastructure is deteriorating at a pace that shocks anyone who remembers the ambitions of the mid 20th century. This is not a passing trend or a momentary dip. It is a structural failure. And here lies the paradox that Donald Trump and his supporters cannot reconcile. The policies he champions, from tariffs to tax cuts tilted toward the wealthy, have not solved these problems but deepened them. The hook here is blunt. People are realizing that the pain they feel in their everyday lives is not coming from some abstract foreign enemy, but from the choices made within their own government, often under leaders who claim to be fixing America. Take inflation as a starting point. In recent years, families have been squeezed by rising costs of food, housing, energy, and healthcare. While Trump often points fingers at China, at migrants, or at political opponents, the underlying drivers are far more domestic. Supply chains neglected for decades, underinvestment in public infrastructure, and financial speculation that drives housing costs out of reach. These are not problems imported from abroad. They are consequences of internal mismanagement. The American people see it when they shop for groceries or pay their utility bills. No matter how loudly Trump shouts about foreign threats, the household budget exposes the truth. Wages tell a similar story. Yes, there has been job growth, and yes, unemployment figures look stable on paper, but the quality of work has been eroded. Gig jobs, unstable contracts, and positions without benefits dominate the landscape for millions. The promise that hard work leads to a stable life is fading. Even in sectors where wages have risen, inflation has outpaced those gains, leaving workers feeling like they are running faster just to stay in place. Trump's message of America First was supposed to reverse this tide, but instead, his administration presided over policies that favored corporate tax relief and deregulation, leaving ordinary workers to face the same systemic challenges without meaningful support. The hook that cannot be ignored is this: the American dream is slipping away not because of competition abroad, but because of decisions at home that consistently put corporate interests above the people. Infrastructure decay is another glaring sign of decline. Americans who travel abroad are often stunned by the modern rail systems, airports, and digital networks in other parts of the world, particularly in Asia. Meanwhile, bridges in the US are collapsing, water systems are outdated and unsafe, and broadband access remains patchy in rural areas. For a country that once prided itself on bold investments like the interstate highway system or the Apollo program, this is a humiliation. Yet, under leaders like Trump, the rhetoric of building greatness was not matched with genuine public investment. Instead, infrastructure became a campaign slogan, a promise deferred year after year. The result is a nation falling behind while others surge ahead. This contrast is not lost on the public, and it fuels a growing awareness that America's decline is not inevitable but chosen. The widening inequality gap is perhaps the most corrosive trend of all. While billionaires multiply their fortunes, the middle class is shrinking and poverty is deepening. Housing costs lock younger generations out of home ownership, student debt cripples opportunity, and healthcare remains the most expensive in the world while delivering mediocre outcomes. Trump's policies, far from addressing these inequalities, often magnified them through tax structures and deregulation that favored the already powerful. Uh, the narrative of restoring prosperity rings hollow when prosperity is so unevenly distributed. The hook here is a hard one. The system is not broken for everyone. It works brilliantly for the wealthy and well-connected, but it fails the majority who are told to keep waiting for a promised revival. And this brings us to the heart of the matter. The American people are waking up to the fact that blaming foreign rivals does not rebuild their roads, lower their rents, or improve their schools. They are recognizing that no tariff war or nationalist slogan can substitute for serious investment, planning, and equitable policy. Trump, who thrives on distraction and deflection, cannot control this awakening forever as more people connect their daily struggles to domestic policy failures rather than external scapegoats. The ground beneath his political theater grows weaker. That is the looming danger for him. When the crowd no longer believes the performance, the show collapses. Donald Trump built his political identity on the claim that he alone could restore America's greatness, that his America First strategy would reassert dominance abroad and prosperity at home. The image he cultivated was not simply that of a leader, but of a fighter, a man willing to challenge global elites and force both allies and adversaries to bend to his will. For millions of his supporters, this was not politics, it was theater, a performance of strength and certainty in a world they felt was slipping out of their control. Yet the stage he built for himself was constructed on fragile foundations, and the realities of global and domestic change are exposing just how brittle his narrative truly is. The hook here is unavoidable, the central promise of Trumpism that America could reimpose its supremacy by sheer force of will is colliding with the fact that the United States is no longer in a position to dominate as it once did. And the evidence of that is mounting daily. Take trade policy, for instance. Trump declared that tariffs on China and other countries would bring back American industry, restore manufacturing jobs, and put competitors in their place. But the actual result was higher prices for consumers, strained supply chains, and retaliatory measures from trading partners that hurt U.S. exporters. American farmers who were promised protection ended up relying on government bailouts to survive the fallout from tariff wars. The bold narrative of winning trade battles has been replaced by the stark reality of economic costs borne by ordinary families. When voters see their grocery bills climb and their businesses struggle, the story of toughness begins to ring hollow. The illusion of strength fades when the policy outcomes are felt in people's wallets. Foreign policy tells a similar story. Trump positioned himself as the master deal maker, someone who could outmaneuver adversaries and reassert American control. Yet his administration left behind a world more skeptical of U.S. leadership, not less. Alliances frayed as he demanded loyalty without offering cooperation, and adversaries like China and Russia expanded their influence while Washington grew more isolated. The attempt to use sanctions as a universal weapon revealed limits when nations built alternative networks of finance and trade. Trump's boastful claims of restoring respect for America were contradicted by a global order that increasingly adapted to move around U.S. pressure. The hook here is sharp. The world is not waiting for America to dictate terms anymore. And when Trump insists otherwise, he exposes the gap between rhetoric and reality. Domestically, his political brand is equally vulnerable. Trump's narrative depends on presenting himself as the champion of the forgotten worker. Yet his record is filled with policies that favored the wealthy and entrenched inequality. tax cuts skewed toward corporations, deregulation that prioritized profits over protections, and a hollow infrastructure weak that never delivered. These are not the building blocks of restored greatness. They are the evidence of a leader who excelled at branding but faltered at governing. For his supporters, the performance may have been compelling, but over time, the disconnect between words and lived experience becomes impossible to ignore. The moment people realize that the promise was a facade, the political brand collapses. What makes this collapse especially dangerous for Trump is his reliance on perception. He thrives on the image of invincibility, the notion that he always fights and always wins. But what happens when the facts cannot be hidden? What happens when the evidence of America's diminishing power is no longer deniable? The hook that strikes hardest is this: Trump's greatest asset, his aura of strength, becomes his greatest liability when it is exposed as an illusion. His narrative does not bend easily to reality, and when forced to confront it, the meltdown is inevitable. The deeper problem is that Trump has no alternative story to tell. His entire political appeal is tied to the idea that America can turn back the clock, reclaim a lost supremacy, and restore a world where Washington dictates the rules. But history does not move backward. The global economy has shifted, alliances have diversified, and domestic challenges cannot be solved with slogans or scapegoats. When these truths become clear to the electorate, Trump is left with nothing but bluster. And bluster, no matter how loud, cannot disguise failure forever. When Donald Trump is confronted with facts that shatter his carefully crafted image, he does not pause, reflect, or admit error. Instead, his instinct is to escalate. This is a pattern we have seen repeatedly from his business career to his presidency, and now in his continuing political campaigns. It is not in his nature to concede defeat. He views every challenge as a personal attack, every piece of evidence as a weapon wielded against him. That is why the danger of his eventual meltdown is not limited to his own reputation. It threatens to destabilize the political environment of the United States. The hook here is urgent. When a leader thrives on denial and confrontation, the collision with reality does not end with quiet resignation. It ends with disruption, division, and the potential for chaos. History gives us clear warning signs. During his time in office, whenever Trump was cornered by facts, he could not spin away. He chose escalation. Faced with investigations into his conduct, he did not simply defend himself, he attacked the institutions responsible. When confronted with poor outcomes from his policies, he did not adjust. He doubled down and blamed scapegoats, foreign governments, immigrants, political opponents, even his own advisors. This instinct to lash out is not a side feature of his character. It is central to how he operates. As the myth of American dominance collapses and his narrative of strength disintegrates, we should expect this instinct to intensify. The meltdown will not be contained within him. It will spill into the public square, amplified by media, rallies, and social platforms, and it will deepen the fractures already weakening American society. Consider the role of rhetoric. Trump has long understood that words can inflame, mobilize, and distract. His speeches are crafted less as policy explanations and more as battle cries, designed to frame politics as a war of us versus them. This works as long as his audience believes he is leading them toward victory. But when the evidence makes clear that victory is not at hand, that the economy is strained, that global influence is waning, that America is no longer feared but often resisted, his only move is to intensify the rhetoric. He will make the threats sharper, The accusations wilder and the division deeper. The hook here is dangerous. A personal meltdown in Trump's case does not mean retreat. It means escalation into a national crisis of polarization. The consequences of this are not hypothetical. We have already glimpsed them. The events of January 6th, 2021 showed what happens when Trump refuses to accept reality and instead insists that his narrative must prevail at any cost. That episode was not an aberration, it was a natural extension of his refusal to concede when faced with defeat. Now imagine that same refusal applied not just to an election result, but to the undeniable evidence of America's changing place in the world. The idea that the US cannot simply dictate global outcomes, that it must share power and compromise, is an existential threat to Trump's worldview. His likely response will be to inflame nationalist anger, frame compromise as betrayal, and cast any acknowledgement of limits as surrender. This is not just a political maneuver, it is the anatomy of a meltdown that endangers the stability of a nation. There is also the matter of Trump's influence over his base. His supporters do not merely see him as a politician, they see him as a symbol of resistance to elites, institutions, and change itself. When Trump melts down, his followers are not likely to abandon him immediately. Many will interpret his escalation as proof that he is fighting harder than ever. This creates a feedback loop where Trump's personal inability to accept reality is reinforced by a loyal base eager to believe his narrative over the evidence before them. The hook here is sobering. A leader's personal meltdown can become a collective delusion, dragging millions of people into a conflict that has no grounding in fact, but immense consequences in practice. The broader risk lies in governance. A Trump who feels cornered is not a Trump who moderates, but one who seeks to test the limits of institutions. We saw flashes of this during his presidency, pressuring courts, attacking the press, undermining intelligence agencies, and defying congressional oversight. In a future moment of crisis, with his narrative collapsing and his pride at stake, his instinct will be to go further. He will frame institutions themselves as illegitimate, eroding public trust, not just in political opponents, but in democracy as a whole. This is why the danger of Trump's meltdown cannot be underestimated. It is not confined to his speeches, it corrodes the very fabric of governance. And yet, the inevitability of this clash with reality is approaching. The United States cannot escape the facts of global power shifts, economic challenges, and domestic discontent forever. At some point, the rhetoric and the reality will collide. Trump has no strategy for managing that collision other than to deny, attack, and escalate. The hook that every American should recognize is that his personal struggle to preserve his narrative will not remain personal. It will be projected onto the nation, turning his inability to face reality into a collective crisis. That is the essence of the danger ahead, the meltdown of one man morphing into a destabilization of democracy itself. America's future does not have to be written in terms of decline, but it cannot be sustained on illusions of supremacy. The idea that the United States can dominate every sphere of global life through military strength, tariffs, or unilateral decrees is no longer credible in a world that has moved into multipolarity. The real path forward is cooperation, diplomacy, and a recognition that shared prosperity is not weakness but survival. Yet, for leaders like Donald Trump, whose political appeal is built on a theater of domination, this truth is intolerable. The hook here is sharp. America's choice is not between global hegemony or collapse, but between embracing cooperation or sliding further into isolation. The evidence for this is everywhere. Consider the pressing global challenges: climate change, pandemics, cybersecurity, energy transition, and financial stability. None of these can be solved by one nation alone, not even one as powerful as the United States. To imagine that tariffs or threats can resolve global supply chain disruptions or control a virus that spreads across borders is to ignore the interconnected reality of the modern world. Cooperation is not a luxury, it is the only workable response. Yet Trump has repeatedly treated alliances as burdens, international agreements as betrayals, and diplomacy as weakness. This posture may win applause from a domestic audience craving signs of toughness, but on the global stage, it isolates America from solutions that are urgently needed. Economic realities reinforce this point. The U.S. no longer holds the lion's share of global GDP. Its markets remain powerful, but they are interdependent with Asia, Europe, Africa, and Latin America. Attempting to decouple from China, for example, or to wage permanent tariff wars would only accelerate the very decline Trump claims to resist. Meanwhile, cooperative frameworks like BRICS, regional trade agreements, and multilateral development initiatives are expanding. They did not seek America's permission. They move forward with or without Washington. The hook is clear. The world is building new networks, and America must decide whether to be inside the room shaping outcomes or outside the door watching influence slip away. Diplomacy offers a path to stability that brute force cannot. Agreements on arms control, joint investment in clean energy, and global health cooperation are all arenas where U.S. leadership could still matter, not as domination, but as partnership. Yet Trump's approach has been to withdraw from agreements, undermine trust, and frame diplomacy itself as capitulation. This strategy may serve a political narrative, but it leaves America weaker in practice. Leaders who understand that cooperation enhances rather than diminishes national strength will be the ones who secure a better future for their people. Trump, by contrast, locks himself into a zero-sum game where every compromise is betrayal and every negotiation is a test of personal pride. That is not strategy, it is self-destruction. The American people themselves are signaling the need for a new approach. Polls consistently show that younger generations value international cooperation on issues like climate change and global justice. They see that America cannot stand apart while the planet warms, while technology races ahead, or while other countries form partnerships that bypass Washington. They understand that greatness in the 21st century will be measured not by how many enemies are punished, but by how many solutions are achieved. The hook here is generational. Trump may cling to an old world model of power, but the future electorate is not buying it. This is the crossroads. America can choose to adapt, embracing its role as a leading partner in a multipolar world, or it can double down on the illusion of supremacy and watch its influence erode. The truth is that cooperation is not weakness, it is leverage. By working with others, America amplifies its strengths and shares burdens. By rejecting cooperation, it isolates itself, squandering both credibility and opportunity. Trump's refusal to see this reality is not just a personal flaw, it is a national risk. When the world demands partnership and America offers only bluster, the consequences will be isolation abroad and frustration at home. And that ultimately is the hook every citizen must grasp. Survival and prosperity in this new century will not come from clinging to myths of domination, but from embracing the power of cooperation before it is too late.